Thank you very much, sir. Before we begin our lecture today, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker, Mr. P. Sainath. As you all know, Mr. P. Sainath is a rural reporter, photojournalist, and the rural affairs editor of The Hindu, and has extensively covered poverty, deprivation, the agrarian crisis, and the aftermath of globalization in India. Believing that journalism is for people and not for shareholders, he has doggedly covered the lives of those who have been left behind. After completing a master's degree in history at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, Mr. Sainath turned to a life of journalism. At Blitz, a Mumbai tabloid, he rose to be deputy chief editor and became a popular columnist. For the next few years, beginning 1993, under a fellowship from the Times of India, Mr. Sainath painstakingly investigated life in India's 10 poorest districts. In Everybody Loves a Good Drought, his best-selling book of 1997, and in hundreds of subsequent articles, Mr. Sainath presented his readers with a picture of the acute misery of India's poorest districts. The misery rooted in India's enduring structural inequalities in poverty, illiteracy, and caste discrimination, and exacerbated by recent economic reforms favoring foreign investment and privatization. Indeed, these sweeping changes, combined with endemic corruption, had led small farmers and landless laborers into crippling debt with devastating consequences. Mr. Sainath has worked extensively through over 200 reports, news articles, and hundreds of photographs on the issue on the agrarian crisis and its various manifestations, including the most extreme, that of farmer suicide. Mr. Sainath's authoritative reporting has even led Indian authorities to enhance relief efforts in states like Tamil Nadu, Rajasthan, and Maharashtra. His photographs, which have accompanied his reporting over the last 30 years, in fact constitute the largest body of photographs on labor in rural India. Mr. Sainath is the recipient of several awards, including the prestigious Shannon Magsaysay Award, which he accepted in 2007, the B.D. Goenka Award for Excellence, and the Harry Chapin Media Award for work that focuses on the causes of hunger and poverty. Mr. Sainath has been a distinguished international scholar at the University of Western Ontario, a visiting lecturer at the Moscow University, a distinguished international professional at Iowa University, a lecturer at Trinity College in Connecticut, and visiting professor at University of California, Berkeley. He has also, over several years, been visiting faculty at Sophia Polytechnic Social Communication Media course, and of course at the Asian College of Journalism in Chennai. We're very happy indeed to have him here to deliver the third T.G. Narayanan Memorial Lecture, and I would now like to invite him to address the audience.
I'm really very much honored to be doing this lecture endowed in the name of T.G. Narayanan. I only learned when you mentioned it that he died in 1962. Had he lived on one more year, he would have seen the most unique legislation on famine ever passed in any country. I'm sure it would have entertained him as it entertains me to find it. It's something of how we deal with famine. In 1963, the government of Maharashtra, in a unanimous vote of the legislature, abolished famine by abolishing the word famine from all laws. I kid you not, we can get onto the net and I can show you the act. It's called the Maharashtra Deletion of the Term Famine from All Laws, 1963. The rationale was the country was still, it was less than 20 years from the Bengal famine. So people hated that word. It caused panic, it caused, and you just wanted to end that chapter and put it behind you. But they chose to do it. They said the preamble to the law says, now that we are an independent nation with a government ever vigilant on the issues of hunger and famine, there is no chance of having famine. So the word famine was deleted from all laws by this law and replaced with the word scarcity. So you see, legally, Maharashtra cannot have a famine. You can have 10,000 people dead. You can have largest number of child deaths from hunger is in Melghar in Maharashtra. But you can't have a famine. You can have hunger deaths. You can have, because scarcity, the law forbids you from having famine. So yeah, so I'm pretty pleased. It was passed just in 63, a year after TJN's demise. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak in a lecture in his name. And thank you, Shreya, for introducing the lecture with the injunction of turn off your cell phones, which I increasingly get. I must tell you that I was once at a lecture of Robert Fisk, the distinguished journalist who's one of the greatest experts on the Middle East. And Fisk began all his lectures, and on that occasion, dramatically, by telling the audience, anyone whose cell phone rings during my lecture will be sold into slavery immediately. And on cue, a phone went off, and it turned out to be his own. So I have put mine off. I mean, I put it on silent. I think so. And so yeah, there are a few things that I want to show. I want to introduce you to a new planet that's springing up in our midst. My own title for the T.G. Narayanan Memorial Lecture this year was actually, my own title is Deprivation, Social and Anti-Social. There's many kinds of deprivation. I had brought some slides. Unfortunately, one stick which had the particular slides that I wanted to show you is missing. But nonetheless, let me try and introduce you to my favorite columns in the newspaper. They appear every Sunday in almost any newspaper that you can describe as Indian. Written by many different kinds of people but organized by a small group. I mean, this is unquestionably the column that occupies my greatest attention on Sunday. It's called The Matrimonials. When you look at the matrimonials, you get an incredible picture of your society. At a glance, the social hierarchies of your society. The way the matrimonials are organized is how your society is organized. Let me just, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but actually it is a fascinating way of window into your social hierarchies. Not only, they have very different, this is the country's and the world's largest English newspaper. Not only do they organize things caste-wise and alphabet-wise, there is a particular group whom they abstract from the rest and isolate them in one column. Who are these? These are the dregs. Who are the dregs? Who make it off into another column. They have 3-4 systems. One is alphabetical, one is caste, one is region, one is occupation, but there is one group. The group doesn't always appear because they're not always the kind of people who can advertise. But they come in this order. The isolated group in the SC/ST, disabled, HIV/AIDS sufferers, Mangliks, divorcees, second marriage and widow remarriage. These come in one separate column. They come one below the other. I have many slides of that. I'm sorry I left that stick at home. But I just picked last Sunday's. It's not something from 3 years ago. This is last Sunday's, and there you have disabled, handicapped, Manglik, SC/ST, second marriage. Now, this is no conspiracy and no evil or vicious person. This is just a clear capture of the mindset of our social hierarchy. As they would say in Mumbai, we are like that only. Right? Yeah. And we are. It may be organized differently in different newspapers, but you can see how a particular bunch of people, they have to know their place in society. This December 6th, we had a massive rally in Mumbai. You know how much the papers have been speculating over rallies of 1 lakh for Modi versus 50,000 for Rahul. The Indian Express estimate of the rally I am talking about, this is the Indian Express, 2 million. 2 million human beings gathered in Dadar. In perfect discipline, no bombs went off, nobody attacked anybody, there was song and dance and there was poetry, and it was the 57th death anniversary of Baba Saheb Ambedkar. Did you read a word about it? 2 million people gathered, 2 million people from all over the country and apparently from about 20 countries across the world. But 2 widows from 85-year-old women from Mo in Indore with 2 rotis folded in their sari travel all the way from Indore to come and attend Baba Saheb's 57th death anniversary. Which leader in the world, alive, let alone dead 57 years ago, draws 2 million human beings? How is it covered? Also tells us a lot about our society. The Mumbai Mirror had 3/4 of a page on the traffic menace that the rally posed. This is standard. Every year, the same coverage, the traffic menace. The Times will talk about how Shivaji Park was turned into one big toilet, and how many people are leaving for the weekend because life is unbearable with the most disciplined rally that you can imagine. You can have 11 days of Ganesh festival and no problems at all. No complaints, no nothing. Here, the arrangements that have to be made are very few because people look after their rally themselves. You have poets and songsters bringing their music and their poetry, publishing it, distributing it for free. Performers, actors, theatre people performing for free. They're doing this for you and me, for anybody who wants to learn something about what the greatest battle for human dignity on the face of this earth is, which is the eradication of caste. But while rallies of 50,000 to 1 lakh make front page first lead, 2 million people barely gets. It wasn't mentioned in there was no separate item on it in the Times of India, except of course on traffic arrangements, and you won't find much better in the other papers. Speaking of those rallies, the tiny rallies that got so much attention, and speaking of deprivation, which I'm going to try looking at the dictionary definition of it and what we should be thinking about it, and whether it's grown or not, and how will it be 20-30 years from now. I was fascinated by the post-poll panel discussions. I confess that once in 5 years I'm a willing party to those myself, but once in 5 years, okay. And immediately the mind again, the classist mindset, that earlier one was caste, comes out. As the results are coming in, one of your leading editors points to the Rajasthan result and says, it shows you. What does it show? It shows that people are rejecting freebies with contempt. Yeah, they're rejecting freebies with contempt. They don't want your free medicines. Well, they want health care. They don't want your free medicines. Actually, the free medicines came pretty late in the day, but still, nonetheless. Now, this is in a country where the health system is now, the health costs of health care are seriously causes of bankruptcy, debt, and sinking below the poverty line. If you look, there were 3 rounds in the NSS which could be called health rounds. 42nd, 52nd and 60th rounds, which had plenty on health. if you look at these three different rounds on health, it shows you that in the last 20 years, the number of Indians not seeking any kind of medical attention, purely for financial reasons, has doubled. From 100, they looked in one round they looked at it in terms of people. In another round they collected it in terms of number of episodes of ill health reported or not reported. So you have to take those different means of measuring, but when you look at it, it goes from 150 per thousand not reported for financial reasons to 284 per thousand not reported for purely this is not accessibility or distance, this is purely financial reasons, that they did not report their ailments for purely financial reasons. As I was telling my students in the ACJ yesterday, at the height of the Andhra farm crisis, and wherever we have documented the farm suicides, in every one of those households, health costs were a huge thing. It's just unbelievable the kind of health costs that poor people have had. They pay much more for a cesarean operation in some of the villages of Andhra than you might in a city, because they're ripped off. They have no choice. They have no option. Yeah? I was giving my students the example from 2000, from the middle of the last decade, when Narasimha Reddy of Eenadu and I came upon a spectacular case of a guy whose life was saved by his friends after he drank pesticide. This was in Nallamada in Anantapur. His friends put him on a cot. He had consumed poison. His wife begged them. They came running, picked him up, put him on a cot that was turned upside down, tied it with ropes, tied it to their shoulders. Each of them had virtually dislocated or fractured shoulders. They ran with that for 4 kilometers to get that guy to the highway, where they then put him in a jeep and took him to the nearest hospital that could treat him, right? Because he was writhing in pain. I don't know if you've seen someone who has taken poison, especially pesticide. It is not a pleasant sight. They got him to the hospital. He was rescued. Narasimha and I landed up there the next morning and entered the hospital to find him abusing his friends in language that would make a sailor on shore leave blush. And mind you, Telugu is a pretty good language for that. And when I asked him, "What are you doing? I mean, these guys saved your life. Your family owes them everything." He looked at me with utter contempt and said, "Neekan telsaya? What the hell do you know?" He said, 4 years of failure in agriculture, I ran up a debt of 1 lakh, which I couldn't repay. Money lenders harassing me. I tried to take my life. 4 days in this hospital, I have a bill of 49,000. Who the hell is going to pay it? On the one hand, you built a society where we boast of being the fastest growing destination in medical tourism, right? And also a few 100 million people who do not seek any medical attention even for serious ailments because they cannot afford it. Okay. Now, by the way, if you come to the wonderful state, the rich state of Maharashtra that's abolished famine, it's privatized medical education to such an extent that, by the way, it's private. It's sort of abolished both medical and education. You have 17 medical colleges that are not recognized by the Indian Medical Council. All these are owned by ministers and MLAs. Some of these medical colleges do not have an anatomy theatre like D.Y. Patil's. Okay, so what do? They don't have. They actually do not have. I think that some of you think I'm pulling a fast one. I'm not joking. They actually do not have an anatomy theatre. So what do? They hire time from public hospitals and take their budding aspiring doctor students to Jaslok or JJ or someplace to visit the anatomy theatre. It gives a whole new meaning to medical tourism. So that's the state of that. But what are we talking about in deprivation? There's many views on what deprivation means and what makes for deprivation. The act or instance of depriving someone of something, the sufferance of loss, the condition of being deprived, privation, the damaging lack of material benefits considered to be basic needs to a society, is how the Oxford Dictionary puts it. Generally, it involves issues of destitution, financial distress. I'm looking at the condition of being deprived of imposed privation and the denial of the basics by a very consciously constructed inequality. There are those, of course, like 180 million human beings in this country who've been deprived of human dignity, which is what we were talking about 5 minutes earlier. But there is also the social and economic ideas of elements of deprivation which we could look at. And now I'm going to introduce you to a new planet, because I'm not going to take deprivation separately from the rest of society and what's happening, because it's linked to what's happening at the other end of the spectrum very closely. I have to tell you this, that this March, when we went out to cover what we love in the media to call the great drought, it's always the greatest drought of the century. There's never been a drought that wasn't. And it really wasn't a drought, it was a water crisis. In the areas, in those regions of Maharashtra, including Mumbai and the Marathwada, a new kind of planet is emerging. It comes up, it exists, I'm sure it exists in Chennai or is due to reach fruition at some point. It's a very interesting kind of building that is coming up. More interesting, who were the construction laborers on these buildings? Almost all of them were marginal farmers or landless laborers who had left their native villages because of the water crisis. Okay. When you ask them, why did you leave this part of Marathwada, or why did you come down from all the way from Telangana into Mumbai and Goregaon and Marathwada, they said, there's no water in our places, we can't do anything. What were they building? They were building multiple storied buildings with a private swimming pool on each floor. Can I have the first of the slides? This is the architect's own photographs. This is in Goregaon. It's called Aqua Grandia. Okay? It's 37. Can you move to the next one? Yeah, those are the two twin towers. Each one of them has this. Each floor, by the way, is one flat. The flats are between 6,000, 4,000, 9,000 square feet. Each one of them has its own swimming pool. Now, this is not a one-off. Many such buildings are coming. Koregaon Park in Pune has 3 already. It's not such a big area, Koregaon Park. It has 3 of these type of buildings. It doesn't have 37 floors. Those are 14 floors and 15 floors. But a swimming pool on every floor. A private swimming pool on each and every floor. Can you move to the next one? Oh yeah. On the road from Mumbai to Pune, you'll find hundreds of these hoardings. They all emphasize exclusive swimming pools. This particular place has 23 villas, each one of them with a separate swimming pool. And don't miss the slogan, luxury homes with an attached forest reserve. In Maharashtra, even the tiger doesn't have a forest reserve. These are coming up in areas of extreme water stress. Okay? And Well, all those workers putting these up are from agricultural backgrounds, many of whom have been devastated. They're refugees from the water crisis. They of course some of them come from areas where we grow sugarcane, the biggest water guzzling thing in that area. 2/3 of Maharashtra sugarcane is grown in drought prone areas. And before we go to the next slide, let's look at some of the others, how they were dealing with water in the same period of the water crisis. Next one. No, not that one. Go back, please. Go back. Yeah. Next, after that one, yes, after the next one to that, right. Watch her. Now this is in the same regions. She's piled up 5 stones. She's standing up there, and she's piled up 5 stones, standing there, and yeah, you can see that. That's a leaking tank at the municipality. She's filling it up there, and then she's going to put it into that. Can you go to the next one? Right? The whole day she spends doing this. She makes about 20-30 visits to this place. Go on. All over these regions were these queues. At the same time, when buildings were coming up with private swimming pools. Yeah. Every member of a family, this is Bharat Raut of Takwiki village. Every member of the family had to give 1 day in the week away from work in order to collect water. He brings up to 65 liters on his motorbike. There is not a vehicle on the roads in that time that is not carrying water. But some of that water is going to swimming pools in the exclusive buildings. Yeah, now we can go to the other folder. One moment. Now this, can you just go back? Yeah, just close it up. I want to tell them something about this. Another group of workers, refugees from Telangana's water crisis, sleep on the floor, sleep on the streets. They've got a double water crisis. In Mumbai, they've got an excess of water because they're sleeping on the street in the monsoon. Where are they working, and why do they sleep in that particular place? They work in one of the most sophisticated facilities in India, the Baba Atomic Research Center, which is seeing a lot of construction work inside. These are labor who've come down from Telangana, from Andhra. They're all Telugus, and they're working here. They sleep outside in the night at rain. It's very entertaining in one pathetic sense. All of them have security clearance IDs. They can enter Baba Atomic. I don't get that clearance. 33 years in journalism, I can't get that clearance to enter the Baba Atomic Research Center. Security clearance ID. Right? And they sleep. Can you open the first one? They sleep in the monsoon like this. Next one. Yeah. Yeah. These are all people who are doing the construction work. Again, who are these people? Marginal farmers, landless labor. That's who they are. That's who these people are. Refugees from an unending and deepening water crisis. Thank you. The same kind of labor you will find in other grand projects, including Maharashtra's 24 golf courses. 24, out of which 19 have come in the period of the economic reforms. And by the way, those do not count what the armed forces have. We don't know how many golf courses the armed forces have. We have no list, but there's a huge number in the country. The average golf course takes between 1.8 million liters and 2.3 million liters per day in season, apart from being the sport that has the highest usage of pesticides for any sporting activity in the world. In Philippines, you have shooting wars between golf courses and farmers, private armies of the golf course owners and the things, because the pesticides have seeped completely into their water. Point is this: that apart from existing deprivation, we as a society are constructing levels of inequality that are simply unsustainable, and that will bring down everybody, not just the deprived. That will the kind of water crisis you're looking at. By the way, Tamil Nadu has a very key role in what's unfolding nationally as the biggest water crisis, which I do not believe progressives give enough attention to. 60% of the water we are using for irrigation now is groundwater. Okay? We are using groundwater in gigantic scale. The government of India's estimate is that there were 20 million borewells in the country in 2009. It's complete nonsense. Yeah? They're being dug all across Maharashtra in 3 months. There were the collector's reports, the divisional commissioner's reports show us per village 3 per day were being sunk. The debt, the bankruptcy, all of that brings is one set of stories. The other is what it's doing to the aquifer, what it's doing to and now the borewells in Maharashtra are hitting. We are in the Deccan Trap, okay? The borewells of Maharashtra are now hitting what are called paleohistoric storages. We are reaching storages of water that are thousands of years old. That isn't my claim. It's the claim of the Groundwater Survey Development Board of Maharashtra. The GWSD's website tells you that we are hitting, especially around Aurangabad and that side, we're hitting paleohistoric storages. What it means to be drinking water that is 10,000 years old, I don't quite know, but apparently we are doing it. Yeah. The deprivation that is taking place is also taking place in terms of a loot of resources, the loot of water like for your swimming pools and stuff, but it's also taking place in despair. Water is the single biggest coming battle. It already exists as the biggest battle. But it's not just between Tamil Nadu and Karnataka over Kaveri, though that is the single biggest political dispute between the two states. Just like Mullaperiyar is between Kerala and Tamil Nadu, just like Almaty is between Karnataka and Andhra Pradesh, and so on and so forth. You can go to the Teesta and the Farakka barrage are problems with Bangladesh, or the Koshi barrage and our problem with Nepal. Which Koshi barrage is one day due to come down with mega debts on both sides, and we will have been responsible for that. But the point is that the water is being used at such a rate, diverted for various purposes, including very significantly for lifestyle purposes, at such a rate that you are looking at a gigantic crisis in that. Now imagine what is the lifestyle and the life impact on those who are being robbed of that water. Take Polavaram. Much larger than Narmada, much larger than the Narmada Dam, much bigger in terms of villages and people displaced. Did you even get anything written about it? Did you read anything about it? Did you have television programs? Pristine forest and wildlife sanctuaries submerged. And by the way, it doesn't increase the Ayakat much, which tells me that it's not for irrigation at all, but for industrial use. There are two giant Reliance SEZs coming up alongside. Okay. Now many people from these areas are your refugees of the water crisis, going elsewhere and working as construction laborers on projects to build swimming pools for somebody else, right? As I said, Tamil Nadu is implicated in a very peculiar way. A small town in Tamil Nadu, Tiruchengodu, is the borewell rig capital of the world. There's something like 25,000 borewell rigs in this town. And if you calculate how much drilling they're doing, it works out to minimum, the most conservative estimate, 2 billion feet of drilling every year into the aquifer. When I went to Tiruchengodu, I didn't know about Tiruchengodu. In the middle of Marathwada, a passing borewell rig, I hear someone speaking Tamil in deep interior Marathwada. So in filmy style, we stopped that rig by bringing our jeep in front of it and everything else. But then we heard 11 different languages, because the owners are from Tamil Nadu, the workforce is from Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, Bihar, Madhya Pradesh, because I asked the Tamil owners and drilling in charge at least, part owner, because 30-40 people own one rig. How come they're all from the north and you guys are from the south? Why can't you don't get Tamilian labor? They said, sir, Tamilian laborers will work for 250 rupees in Tamil Nadu, not outside. So who does? People from the Hindi belt, Chhattis. So there were 11 languages spoken in that borewell rig team, from Chhattisgarhi to Tamil, from Bengali, Odia, you name it. The cook was a Kannadiya. That's because to save on taxes, more than half the borewell rigs are not registered in Tiruchengood. They're registered in Kerala, Karnataka and Andhra. Because if I own 21, if I own a fleet of 21, as the biggest owner does, I don't want to be paying taxes on that, do I? So this little town accounts for 2 billion feet of drilling at a very conservative estimate. They don't agree with my estimate. They say it's much more and they're pretty proud of that. Yep, it's an astonishing. When I was sitting in Tiruchengood, after I spoke to those guys, I came here. One rig was returning from Mizoram. Another had been in Assam. There are guys who have lived 6 months, Tamilians who have lived 6 months in Rajasthan and Marathwada. Right. Now, by the way, somebody is being dispossessed of this water. One of the biggest things, you see it in small instances, or you see it in very large one-off cases like Plachimada and Co. But there are countless thousands of legal and illegal bottled water companies across this country. Coming up, somebody is being deprived of that water. Somebody is being dispossessed of that water. There is less and less and less. The India Rural Development Report of IRMA and the Ministry of and the MRD shows you a very frightening picture in what is happening about per capita availability of water. Right. So that is one, the loot of those resources. If you look at the giant SEZs, the giant land projects, the giant land grabs across the country, water is woven into every one of them. You can look at Polavaram, you can look at Pollepalli. But just to give you an idea of the scale of such displacements, Pollepalli is one small SEZ near Shamshabad Airport in Andhra Pradesh. 1,000 acres acquired, 3,500 people displaced. Now you do the math. When I tell you that government of Andhra admits to 20 lakh acres, it admits to 10 lakh acres being acquired in 1 decade. Then you do the math about how many people have been thrown off. Okay, not all of that was inhabited land, some of it was water body, but still, damn it, it's huge. If 3,500 people were displaced from 1,000 acres, between 10 and 20 lakh acres, you just imagine how many people are going, what their lives are. Yeah, there is an incredibly rich strata emerging in rural India. Some real wealth out there. Yeah. By the way, they'll be your next generation MLAs and stuff, input dealers, that sort of person. Despite this, our policies are geared towards A, privatizing water, B, getting into more water intensive stuff like Mr. Pawar, not satisfied with sugarcane, has launched out on cultivating roses in the water stress. Sugarcane, by the way, takes 18 million liters for 1 acre of output from start to finish. 18 million acres. That's 7.5 swimming pools, Olympic size swimming pools. Roses take 6 liters per rose or 21.2 million liters for an acre of cultivation. Indian companies are cultivating roses for Netherlands, not only in Pune, but in Ethiopia and in Kenya. The Karturis and others are doing that. I mean, you're into rose cultivation for the world's greatest market for roses and tulips. Tamil Nadu is growing tulips. It's insane and absurd for you. I mean, what the hell are you going to do with the tulip? But you're growing them on a large scale. And you can look at, say, POSCO. Water issues come up very significantly into the acquisitions and the the brutality of what's happening. You can look at Kalinga Nagar, where 16 people shot dead, 4 more dying subsequently in Gunda instigated violence by the corporates that were involved like Tata. You can look at Gopalpur where there are land and water. Here's my basic point to you. The two greatest crops in the world are not wheat and rice. The two greatest crops in the world are hunger and thirst. And the contemporary and unfolding capitalism is going to rest on grabbing all the resources related to those. The one set of companies on Wall Street that did not make losses even in 2008 were food and agribusiness companies. Okay? Grabbing the resources, land is the game, water is the game. The kind of effort to grab, this idea that this particular land, SEZ, is for tidal path, that's all nonsense. Yeah, the Gopalpur SEZ was taken to build a steel plant. Tata is now earning rental money on the Gopalpur steel plant, for which it acquired the land in 1995 at 40,000 to 1 lakh per irrigated acre. It is now 45 to 50 lakhs per acre in that region. And Tata has been allowed to change purpose and get rentals on that SEZ. No steel plant, no whisper or mention of a steel plant. The change of use has been permitted. You can look for similar instances, whether it's but what another thing is common, and this is very important to us as citizens and human beings. It is, you will be surprised to hear that, as you know, I've written millions of things on electoral law, on paid news, and some of the work I've done has had some impact in changing election commission's rules and laws and norms. But when you look at what's happening here, I will not go along with the electoral law that says anyone who has received a sentence for 2 years should be banned from elections. Lakhs of people in this country are under false cases for resisting corporate power and dispossession. Every child in the POSCO villages of Govidpur and Dinkia has 10, 15 cases over his head. It is very easy to get a 2-year conviction at a lower court in this country. It's very easy to get that. Look, Dayamani Barla, one of the foremost human rights defenders in this country. She's got how many cases? How many cases has Uday Kumar got? In Kalinganagar, the couple known as, the man known as Ravi Jarika, he and his wife, Adivasis with degrees from University of Cuttack, never been in a police station in their lives. After they fought Tata, they have 91 cases against them. They can't do anything else but go to court. Yes. What you're looking at is a gigantic criminalization of dissent. And it's reserved for the lower orders. It's reserved for those at the bottom. You and I will get, we can get Prashant Bhushan to fight our cases. Right? Ravi Jarika can't. The people in Jaitapur and Kudankulam can't. The people in POSCO and Gopalpur and Kalinganagar, they can't. They have the kinds of cases. A 78-year-old woman at Srikakulam whom I meet, fisherwoman, trying to defend their little bay against one big corporation. She has 6 cases of attempted murder. She can't hold the damn sickle. Okay? She's got 6 cases of attempted murder against her. Please multiply that woman by 1 million. You're looking at that scale. First, we're looting these people. Second, we're destroying their livelihoods. Third, deprivation is also about the stealing of livelihoods. Third, we're criminalizing them when they protest. Okay? You really need to think whether a sane and civilized society can permit this to happen. There are fight backs. There are some interesting things that happen. With all these problems on water and land, what is the stated aim of every government in this country successively? How to quietly privatize water. Every state has a law on its statute books that is making for backdoor privatization. In Maharashtra, it's called the Maharashtra Water Resources Regulatory Authority Board. which can decide what kind of irrigation you will have. It can decide, it has decided in some cases, you will use only sprinkler, because two members of the cabinet are owners and part owners of Jain Irrigation, are connected with it, which is the biggest maker of sprinklers in Maharashtra. And they are going to give 75% subsidy on that. Essentially they are paying their ministers and their, okay, right. Andhra had, Chandrababu Naidu brought such a law even before, he was the far-seeing visionary. So he brought that law. I happened to be there in one of the great moments of history in the water struggles of this country, where the deprived spoke up. They formed what the World Bank's president, Wolfenson, it was Wolfenson. After him was Wolfowitz. Doesn't matter, a wolf by any other name. But Wolfenson had come down to preside over the inauguration of the Confederation of Water Users Associations of Andhra Pradesh at the dam in Mehboob Nagar. Yeah? So I love that term, Water Users Associations. The rest of us are dryland bacteria. We don't use, every damn species on planet Earth uses water. Okay? So water users are who are they? They are the richest farmers, they are contractors, they are builders, they are the village mafia. These are your big water users. So Wolfenson came. Unfortunately, the non-water users, feeling excluded, gathered in tens of thousands and stormed the highway and chased Wolfenson. They chased the guy. His convoy had to turn around and flee. That was led by the Andhra Pradesh Kisan Sabha, the particular, and the agricultural workers unions together. Wolfenson had to flee from there, but they were determined. Naidu, after all, was a dynamic CEO. He was determined that would be inaugurated. They were supposed to unveil the plaque on the dam in Mehboob Nagar. But since Muhammad could not go to the mountain had to be moved to Muhammad. So they put up a special helipad in the nearby jungle, and he landed there in his helicopter and inaugurated the plaque. Yeah? The water users, so Confederate, there wasn't a drop of water anywhere around, but he inaugurated the Confederate. Yeah, so you're having these kind of battles. Incidentally, those hundreds and hundreds of activists who led that struggle, including people like P. Madhu, still have 20 to 30 cases on their heads. Attempted murder. You push the policeman, right? So, attempted murder. At the lower court level, it's very easy to get a decision for 2 years. It will be overturned. Dayamani Barla, look at her. I mean, what violence is that woman capable of? She's got 9 cases on her head right now, all of which could get her sentences of 5 years and above. The levels, the water battles are going to be extremely violent. It's no longer, as I said, Karnataka versus Tamil Nadu. Water struggles are brother killing brother. Kurnool, Andhra Pradesh. Old man dies, has 20 acres, 19 acres, 5 sons. Okay. Very easy to divvy the land. Younger brother kills older brother. Because what was the fight about? Who will get that plot which has the bore wells? That was the fight. Okay. So it's right up there from international disputes down to brother killing brother over water. Resources of ordinary people are being looted like they are, where Coke, Pepsi and thousands and thousands of other bottled water companies are taking away the water of local communities. You need to think about that. Anyway, we've all been familiar with the agrarian or farm crisis as it has unfolded. Just let's bring it up to date in terms of a few numbers to give you an idea. Right now Parliament is in session. Parliament has a 17-day session. It convened on December 5th. It adjourns on December 21st. Typically what happens in 17 days in India, mostly rural India, In 17 days, 800 farmers will take their own lives. They'll commit suicide. Between 8,000 and 12,000, according to the police, will attempt suicide. Non-governmental organizations like Sneha do not agree with that figure. The police say attempts to suicide ratio is 10 to 12. Sneha says 15 to 20. It's an organization that specializes in responding to suicide. So 800 to 8,000 to 12,000 will attempt it. 34,000. There will be 34,000 fewer farmers in the country, at least in terms of farmer status or main worker cultivator status, because we are losing that status at the rate of 2,000 a day according to the latest census data. Yeah. There are 15 million fewer full-time farmers in 2011 than there were in 1991. 7.7 million. Where will they go? If you look at the columns of farmers, that's depleting massively. You look at the column of agricultural laborers, that's trebling. In my home state of Andhra Pradesh, in last 10 years, there are 1.3 million fewer farmers, there are 3.4 million more agricultural laborers, which argues that several are falling into the ranks of the agrarian underclass. About 10,000, between 17 and 20 plus thousand children will die of hunger, malnourishment and waterborne related diseases in 17 days. If you take the government of India's figures, if you take UNICEF's figures, you'll be on the higher side. And many thousands more, mainly rural children, like those in Thane, Melghat, elsewhere, will enter what is known as grade 3 or grade 4 malnutrition, from which there is very little comeback. Once you're in grade 4, even if you live, you're a vegetable. You're a piece of sponge actually. By the way, in the same 17 days, the government of India, just the central government alone, will write off 21,500 crores on just 3 heads. Direct corporate income tax, which was 4,110 crores, customs duties and excise duties. Totally in the year, that's about 4,62,000 crores in just the union budget. Because there are many other freebies, which that leading editor thought that people are rejecting. The corporates are accepting freebies. There are no problems at all. They're not shy about that. They take them in very large numbers. Meanwhile, the latest on farming in the last 1 year is the government's Million Farmer Initiative. I don't know if any one of you has had the entertainment of reading this document. Have any of you seen it? It's a PPP, private-public partnership, there's a 7,000 crore budget, out of which half, 50%, 3,500, is an outright gift of the central government. Who is organizing the Million Farmer Initiative? To train and upgrade. You see, your farmers are all very stupid people. They produce things so much cheaper than other farmers elsewhere with their hard labor. How do we upgrade their skills and how do we train them? So, this 3,500 crores is divided between about 40 corporations. So, and the corporations have been allotted. Have you seen this document? The corporations have been allotted as, we didn't get it from the government. We got it from Ashoka and FICCI. The corporations have been allotted crops and regions. ITC has been allotted 10,000 farmers in Tamil Nadu, in South Tamil Nadu. So the MBAs of ITC, MBAs from Wharton or wherever they are from, of ITC Kolkata, are going to train the farmers of South Tamil Nadu to grow ragi, which these blokes have been doing for only 2,000 years and therefore know nothing, right? There are Tata farmers, there are Ambani farmers, there are Birla farmers. This is the Million Farmer Initiative. It's a 20 corporate initiative. Yeah. Bit by bit, your agriculture, your livelihoods are being handed over to the corporate world. Yeah, that's deprivation. You are depriving people of the most basic assets, of the most basic livelihoods, of the most basic things that they need to get on with their lives. That's why I said the two greatest crops are hunger and thirst. How do you exploit those? And those are linked very closely to your deprivation as it exists and how you build it. The old biblical saying no longer holds, Today you do not reap what you sow. In the first place, you don't decide what you sow. Right? And someone else decides that. When you sow, someone else reaps. Someone else consumes. It's a corporate controlled, elite driven world, and the media, by the way, are central to this moral economy of the elite. The selling of this idea that corporate agriculture, the corporate takeover of agriculture is the best thing that can happen to your country. In every case, the levels of to this end, to shift that, whether it's in credit, whether it's in resources, whether it's in subsidies, every move that your governments make furthers corporate control over agriculture. If you leave out direct land ownership, if you leave out direct act of daily cultivation, which sector of agriculture is outside their control? Water will be privatized. In Maharashtra, half a dozen towns, distribution of water is already privatized. They are planning to do it with rural irrigation. A PIL stopped them from privatizing the management of the biggest dams and river basins in the state. It was stopped by a public interest litigation. Okay? Seed controlled by corporations. Pesticide controlled by corporations. Fertilizer controlled by corporations. Each and every sector is sewn up by these guys. Yeah? You're talking about the disposition and deprivation of millions and millions and millions of people. What kind of life we are imposing on these beings? What kind of, I'm thinking again of those construction workers putting up those buildings with swimming pools. They were all once marginal farmers or landless laborers working in those areas. You can see this inequity. It's structured. We've always been unequal. So what? The inequality of the last 20 years, actually we haven't always been, and in fact there is post-independence a certain amount of decline in some kinds of inequality, but in the last 20 years never has inequality been so consciously constructed, so ruthlessly engineered and so brutally enforced. Okay. Oh yeah, I forgot to tell you about farmers. The state that Amitabh Bachchan is still fighting a battle to be recognized as a farmer. He brought a patta from Uttar Pradesh to show that he is accepted as a farmer in Uttar Pradesh to gain tribal land in Mulshi, on the Mulshi Dam. That fight is still going on. Initially, the Tehsildar granted him that. Then when lots of people made a noise, they withdrew the permission. Yeah. Now, this sounds funny to you, but it isn't funny when you get to know where agricultural credit is going. Last year, or the figures I think are for 2011, agricultural credit in Maharashtra, 53% of agricultural credit, not rural credit, agricultural credit in Maharashtra was disbursed from urban and metro bank branches in 3 cities, Mumbai, Pune, Nashik. All those struggling farmers of Malabar Hill. Yeah. 38% was disbursed through rural branches of banks in Maharashtra. 38% was disbursed in rural branches, 53% in urban and metro branches, for God's sake. Yeah. So when Mr. Chidambaram claims that he doubled and trebled agricultural credit, he is not lying technically. I mean, the money is gone up. Who's getting the money is the question. Yeah? Which kind of farmer is getting it? The biggest farmer I know is Mukesh Ambani. Yeah, I kid you not. ICICI is another giant. They're getting agricultural credit. They're getting the terms of trade. In 2010, I was witness to a spectacular event in Aurangabad. By the way, Aurangabad is a very backward area. Marathwada is a backward area. Aurangabad's per capita income is 1/3 that of Mumbai, the Marathwada region. It set a world record. A small group of businessmen bought 150 Mercedes-Benz at one shot. So I was excited. I mean, this was India shining as never before. So I immediately raced down to Aurangabad and wanted to know where the money had come from. It came 66 crores, 150 because it cost 66 crores. I was very delighted to learn that there were many different categories within Mercedes-Benz, from Aam Aadmi edition to super duplex luxury. Then I found that where did the money come from? State Bank of India, Aurangabad branch. So of course I landed up at the State Bank of India, Aurangabad branch. What was the interest rate? They were very shy about that. But of course, one good thing about the banks, they still have unions, right? So the union dug out the figure. 7% interest rate. 7% interest rate for the 150 Mercedes-Benz. Then I said, guys, suppose I want to buy a tractor from you. The chap said, we'll do you a deal. 12.75% for 3 lakhs. But if you go more than, good tractors are about 7 to 8 lakhs. If your amount crosses 4 lakhs, then it's 14% interest. 3.5 lakhs is 13% interest. Then you cross 4 lakhs, you're in the region of 5 lakhs, it touches 14% interest. 7% interest for Mercedes-Benz, 14% for tractors. It's also true that subsequently they lowered the interest rate on agricultural loans, except that there were no loans. They lowered the rate. You try finding that small person in Yavatmal, in Anantapur, in Kurnool, who has got that loan at substantial rates. Professor R. Ramakumar of TIFF has shown you that between 2001 and 2007, loans of under 2 lakhs collapsed, which are the small farmers' loans. Which are the loans that doubled? Loans of between 10 crore and 25 crore. I don't know when last you met a peasant who took a 10 crore loan. I did. As I said, his name is Mukesh. All in all, when you look, by the way, the new deprivation is reinforcing existing ones. It's giving new expressions to existing ones. The Dalits and Adivasis, though Milind Kamble and Chandraban Prasad might think so, are not escaping the discrimination imposed on them by the earlier system. In fact, it's finding newer forms of expression. It's finding newer forms of exclusion. It shows in the kind of employment available to them, how they're excluded from various forms of various jobs that you and I can aspire to, but they cannot. So you are having new inequalities and deprivations piled on top of old and existing deprivations and inequalities. Can something happen? Is there a way out? Of course there is. This is the point at which, as I wind up, when somebody inevitably in every talk asks me, can't you say something optimistic? Or, we all know the problem, let's talk about solutions. I would like to tell you that, I don't take either the fake optimism that allows you to run away from your responsibilities. Things are changing, right? So we don't have to do much. Things are changing, they're actually much better, they're dynamic. So I can just go about my life and, spend more time in my private swimming pool on the 30th floor. The other extreme is the cynical pessimism. Kuch sudrega nahi, nothing's going to change. Therefore, I am absolved of the responsibility or need to do anything. Fake optimism and cynical pessimism both arrive at the same address. I think between fake optimism and cynical pessimism, there is a territory called hope. I live there. And when I see those tens of thousands of peasants chasing Wolfenson and his helicopter off the streets, off the highway, and to go and cover in a jungle and open this thing. When I see, like it happened in 2004, that the farming community and the peasant community and the rural workers brought down governments all over the country that were thought, when we were sure, the opinion polls said that they would sweep, and nothing of the sort happened. It tells us that there is hope. But logically, honestly, do I think things will get better? Of course. They'll get a lot worse before they get a lot better. The responsibility in that then is ours. Not to lose connection with the way people live. And to my students in the ACJ, I will say it again. There is no better journalism than telling stories through the lives of people. Through the lives of everyday life of everyday people. That is the journalism that you need. It needs sensitivity. It needs that extra bit of sensitivity. That you do not lose sight of how others are living. Rather than assuming that everyone is doing well because we are doing well. Every one of us in this room, I'm sure, is doing very well. I am. So, in one of the great institutions of Tamil Nadu, in the CMC of Vellore Medical College, they teach you when you enter CMC, what the mind does not know, the eye cannot observe. So if you don't know tuberculosis, it's not in your knowledge, you will not recognize it, your eye will not know it. I completely agree with that, and I will add one more thing for all of you, especially the young aspiring journalists and social scientists in the audience. What the mind does not know, the eye will not see, cannot observe. What the heart does not feel, your eye will never see. Thank you.